I used to think that I was a genius, but when I look back at it now, it's so embarrassing that I might just go crazy. However, the fact remains, I truly believed that I was a genius. At the start, I did have enough talent to allow for such a misguided belief. During my childhood, I had no trouble when it came to learning new things, and I was able to improve my skills at a faster rate than others. However, things were only easy at the beginning. Although I improved faster than everyone else at first, when things really got going, I slowed down to match the others' pace. I didn't think much of it at first since I thought that these things could happen. After all, wasn't I still improving little by little? I can still do it. Why? Because I'm a genius. In the end, I was forced to accept the reality that I had tried so hard to reject. I wasn't a genius. It was all thanks to meeting a real genius, one who I couldn't even compare to, that I was finally forced out of this ridiculous and childish delusion. The me who thought I was a genius was but a frog in a well. Inside the comfort of my little well, I had gotten drunk on a false sense of superiority. Meanwhile, the real geniuses were already flying through the wide open sky. I hated that genius. I felt my killing intent rising whenever I heard him spout nonsense about how anyone could possibly be able to do what he had done if they really tried. Whether or not he really believed what he said, or he was just looking down on the efforts of someone less talented than himself, it still made me feel like shit. Are you jealous? Fuck jealousy. You're the one who started talking shit first. I just returned the favor, so how the fuck am I being jealous? I didn't think that you'd take it like that. I was just feeling sorry for you. Feeling sorry? What? If you just tried a little harder. Just what do you know that makes you think you're qualified to preach about hard work? You could be a lot better than you are now. Hey, I'm doing perfectly fine, thanks. Your standards are just too damn high. Do you really think that everyone can be like you? Since you're a genius, don't assume that everyone else is capable of doing what you do. Got that? I can't be as great as you. Fuck off. I could barely squeeze out these words. A gaping hole was running through my chest. To try and treat my wound, they were desperately casting magic and pouring out drops of the precious elixir, but it was pointless. No, please no, she's crying. I never expected a girl like her to make that sort of expression for me. Even though we argued about everything, and she always had a nasty look on her face whenever she talked to me, I guess she still got a little attached to our quarrels. That's why I told you. Just go back. Why did you have to be so stubborn and keep following us, Sienna? For now, just put that away. My voice wasn't coming out the way I wanted it to. It was probably because of all the blood rising up my throat. I don't need the elixir. You don't have enough of them to be wasting one here. Don't be foolish, but enough. I'm the one who knows my own body best. There's no way I'll survive. I'll be dead soon. I was dying. I had resigned myself to this fact even before my chest had been pierced. In the first place, my body was so broken that it must have looked like I was embarking on a fool's errand. They told me to turn back and wait for them, but I had ignored all their worries and their lectures to follow them up to this point. I could have avoided it. His voice was as cold as ever. This son of a bitch. It looks like he'll be a pain to deal with until the very end. So there was no need for you to do this. Didn't I tell you to fuck off already? Even though it's so hard to talk right now, why does he keep yapping at me like this? You should have known that as well. His expression showed that he just couldn't understand. There was a chance that he was correct. Even though it might have looked like a desperate crisis to the others, it probably hadn't seemed all that dangerous to him. Didn't I know that? Of course, I did. After all, we've been traveling together for so long. So I knew just what kind of an unspeakable monster he was. And even among all those who called him a monster, I was especially familiar with his abilities. There was no need for you to die like this. Then how else was I supposed to die? He should know it as well. How much of a miracle it was for me to have come this far. Without him, I would never have made it here. At least like this, it's an honorable death. It was so hard to get my voice out, but I had to say this. I would become nothing but a burden if I went on with you, but I didn't want to turn back either. And I didn't want to try and live an ordinary life with this crippled body of mine. Since you're so talented, you really didn't need me to cover for you, right? Even though I knew this, I still threw my body in the way. My body that was no longer able to move properly, just for a moment, moved exactly as I wanted it to. Thanks to that, I was able to push this detestable bastard out of the way, and I ended up with this huge hole in my chest. I'm tired now, so just get going already. Slowly, it was becoming even harder to speak. It felt like my own voice was coming to me from a distance, and, from even farther away, I could hear the sound of weeping. My body was so heavy that I couldn't even move a finger. Everything in front of me was growing dark. Thanks. In my final moments, I heard his voice. Bastard, if you're going to say it, why didn't you say it sooner? Still, it made me feel good. After all, this was the first time I'd ever heard him thank me. Wah, what the fuck? Demon Slayer, God of War, Master of all these were some of the many titles given to the great Vermouth. But among all these titles, there was one that best described him, that of the hero. 300 years ago, our hero, the great Vermouth, set out on an adventure along with his companions. It was an old fairy tale that had been read to him ever since he could walk. It was about the adventures of the great Vermouth, the wise Sienna, the faithful Anis, the brave Molin, and the stupid Hamel. All the others get called great, wise, faithful, or brave, so why am I the only one who gets called stupid? Whenever his nanny read him this tale as a bedtime story, a raging fire was stoked in Eugene Lionheart's chest. If only he could speak properly instead of babbling. Or if, at the very least, he could move his body properly. Even that blockhead Molin got packaged as the brave one. So why am I the stupid one? Did the two of us get switched at some point? No matter how much he racked his brain, he couldn't understand how they had come up with the brave Molin. The brave? They don't know jack shit about him. More like, the foolish Molin. The stupid Hamel was always jealous of Vermouth. Hamel called Vermouth, who was better than him at everything, his rival. Although no one else actually agreed with this. The bastard who wrote this must have been someone who I beat up in the past, Eugene spat out as he ground his teeth in anger. Actually, it wasn't that difficult to understand why the contents of the story were like this. These bedtime stories were aimed at children, so they needed to be easy to read as well as fun and educational. Hamel was constantly running ahead of Vermouth. He kept this up even when they reached the crossroad leading to the Demon King's castle. Although Vermouth said they needed to go right, Hamel was stubborn and insisted on going left. Bullshit. Eventually, Vermouth agreed to listen to Hamel. However, along the path they took, a devilish trap was lying in wait for them. Stupid Hamel. He shouted boastfully that the Demon King had laid a trap for them because the Demon King was afraid of him. What an idiot. The 10-year-old Eugene clenched his fist tightly. He might have already read this story hundreds of times, but each time he reached this point in the story, rage welled up within him. Hamel was a troublemaker. He had a fiery personality, so he frequently ended up fighting with his companions. They got that part right. After many adventures, Vermouth and his companions entered the Demon King's castle. Even after entering the Demon King's castle, stupid Hamel refused to listen to Vermouth. Hamel, who kept running ahead, couldn't avoid any of the traps, and thanks to that, Vermouth and his companions experienced many crises. Like this bastard even knows what it was like, scolded Eugene through gritted teeth. The traps in the hellish Demon King's castle weren't something one could avoid just because they wanted to, so even though they had known that traps laid ahead, they still had no choice but to break through forcefully. Hamel was always arguing with his companions. Stupid Hamel. Rude Hamel. However, Hamel loved his companions. Hamel, who was covered in scars, sacrificed himself for his companions instead of running away. In his final moments, while cradled in the arms of his loving comrades, Hamel regretted that he had never been honest with them. Sienna, he said, I've always liked you. I didn't like her. Anis, please pray for me. I didn't say that. Molin, you're the bravest warrior. That bastard was just a blockhead. Vermouth, make sure to defeat the Demon King. Vermouth swore an oath on Hamel's tears that he would definitely defeat the Demon King. At these words, Hamel peacefully closed his eyes. There was nothing more to see after this. With a furrowed brow, Eugene closed the book. So my character was sacrificed for the sake of a good bedtime story. Countless children had been taught a lesson about how even someone like stupid Hamel could hide a righteous heart inside his chest. He had sacrificed himself for his comrades, and he had even regretted being dishonest. Fuck, did they really have to sell my good name for such a cheap lesson? Even though he had read it several times, he still got angry every time. Finally, venting his rage, he threw the book across the room. He secretly desired to find the person who had written the story and beat them to a pulp, but the author of this book, which had already been around for 300 years, was anonymous. Vermouth, Sienna, Anis, and Molin, you four are also to blame, you bastards. How could you allow a fairy tale like this to be written? Damn you, Sienna. Even though you cried like that when I snuffed it. Did none of you even consider protecting your dead colleague's honor? He suspected that might actually be the case, or at least he did once he had recovered from his outburst and caught his breath. After all, it wasn't like they could have expected that Hamel would be reincarnated with a complete memory of his past life. Damn reincarnation. Eugene recalled all the time he had spent crying in his crib. In his opinion, his years of infancy were just as torturous as going through the Demon King's castle. On top of his thoughts being fuzzy, he couldn't even move or speak properly. So he was forced to spend every day of those long and terrible years chewing on a pacifier or staring up at the mobile hanging from the ceiling. There was a reason why, as a 10-year-old, he had such a foul look in his eyes. From a young age, he had been forced to kill time by just staring into the distance. Eugene released a heavy breath as he rubbed the bridge of his nose. I'm fine with reincarnation, but would I have to get reborn as one of Vermouth's descendants? Vermouth's surname was Lionheart. If I'm going to get reincarnated, aren't there a lot of places that I could have gone to? So why, of all things, did I get stuck with Vermouth's bloodline? Anyone else might have celebrated having such a powerful background, but there was no way that Eugene, who still had the memories of his previous life, could do that. All his life, he had wanted to outshine Vermouth. Although he hadn't yelled about being rivals as the story claimed he did, it was true that Hamel had tended to be conscious of the guy throughout their journey. In the end, he hadn't been able to escape Vermouth's shadow. No matter how hard he practiced and strived, he still couldn't shorten the distance between them. The great Vermouth. Eugene raised his head and looked at the large portrait hanging on the wall. The Vermouth depicted within it looked exactly the same as his memories from his past life. A stupid Hamel. He took a mirror out of his vest and looked at his reflection. The face of a 10-year-old child looked back, one who didn't resemble Vermouth in the slightest. However, since his last name was Lionheart, he really was a descendant of Vermouth. At first he had thought that this was all just a long dream following his death. However, he had long since come to accept that this was his new reality. The stupid Hamel had reincarnated as the descendant of the great Vermouth. During his lifetime, Vermouth had many concubines alongside his legal wife. He wasn't someone who seemed overly interested in women, but I guess he changed with age. The Vermouth from Eugene's memories wasn't just abstinent, he was practically ascetic. To think that such a man would end up with 10 concubines and a whole host of descendants. In the end, he was still human after all, so I guess I get it. Only the descendants of the legal wife were recognized as the direct lineage of Vermouth. Although Eugene's family was also surnamed Lionheart, they were only of a collateral line. Even so, it wasn't like they were left destitute. Although it might not be much compared to the main estate in the capital, Eugene's family mansion was lavish enough to seem showy in its rural surroundings. So even though they were just collateral descendants, they were still being treated according to their station. Within this spacious mansion, the gigantic gymnasium especially showcased its majesty. Descendants who inherited the blood of the great Vermouth the hero, the god of war, the master of all, were not allowed to neglect their training. These words had been hammered into Eugene from a young age. Not again. Erhard Lionheart looked down at his 10-year-old son with tired eyes. While he had also been diligent in training from a young age, his young son had already put all his past efforts to shame. Although he might also be a descendant of the great Vermouth, Gerhard actually had no talent for the martial arts. It really did break. Whenever he saw his son, he couldn't help but feel mixed emotions. From Eugene's behavior, which wasn't like a child's, to his sharp eyes that didn't hold a shred of innocence, Gerhard felt there was always some distance between them. Even though Eugene had lost his mother when he was young, Gerhard had never once seen his son cry out for his dead wife. And that wasn't all. His son's talent was great, so great that it was hard to believe that they shared the same blood. He's a monster. Although this wasn't an appropriate thought to have about his only son, Gerhard couldn't help but feel fear at times. He was only 10 years old, a child who had yet to even dabble with mana, but his skill when wielding a wooden sword needed to be seen to be believed. I was just swinging it, and it broke. Eugene lowered the sword with a click of his tongue. The wooden sword had been embedded with an iron core, making it too heavy to handle with just the strength of a child. Even so, Eugene had insisted on using a sword like this one ever since he was 7 years old. At first, Gerhard had thought it was just childish stubbornness. He had even thought it would be cute to see Eugene try and wield it with tears in his eyes. However, it had already been 3 years since then. Now, Eugene could wield this sort of heavy wooden sword with ease and had even gone on to add sandbags when the initial weight proved insufficient. Erhard gulped as he looked down at the floor, which was strewn with pieces of a broken wooden sword and a completely shattered practice dummy. How long had it been since the dummy was last replaced? Around 3 days. But this wasn't anything to be surprised about. Every single one of the practice dummies in the gymnasium had to be replaced at some point. The village blacksmith skills are garbage, Eugene growled. Although these words were too harsh to come from a child's mouth, Gerhard didn't bother to point this out. That was just part of Eugene's innate character. Gerhard had struggled to correct his son's manners throughout his childhood, but Eugene's wild nature hadn't changed a bit. Doesn't he feel ashamed to accept money in exchange for this crap? He should be summoned and given a thrashing, but father, you're just too merciful. That's a ham, don't waste your time thinking about that. Next time, we'll get something a little more durable. Don't bother with the practice dummy, just get me a whole block of high purity iron. It's just going to get smacked by a wooden sword, so there's no need to give it a shape. Erhard just stared at his son, unable to find the words. He noticed that his son now had such a hardened physique, it was hard to believe he was just 10. To be honest, if they fought barehanded, he suspected that he might even lose. I've fathered a caveman. Erhard was unable to feel pure joy regarding his son's talent. Was it because he felt that his son was a monster? No, that wasn't the reason. Among the many feelings that Gerhard had for his son, there was also a sense of pride. Unlike his father, Eugene had been born with brilliant talent, so how could he not feel pride? However, along with this pride came a sense of guilt. It was an indisputable fact that, as a father, he was lacking in influence. Just because the descendants of Vermouth were all Lionhearts, it didn't mean that the families were all treated the same. It had already been hundreds of years since Gerhardt's branch of the family was forced out into the countryside, and they mostly went ignored even among the collateral branches. Should he tell his son about the reality of the situation? No, it would be better not to. After all, wasn't such a topic too difficult for a young child to understand? Can't I just use a real sword? Without even considering it, Gerhardt bitterly shook his head. You can't do that yet because of the bloodline continuation ceremony. That's right. If you take part in the bloodline continuation ceremony 3 years from now, you'll be allowed to wield a real sword. Isn't it fine if we just keep it a secret between the two of us? Something like that is not allowed. Because I am a Lionheart, I can't just ignore family traditions. The bloodline continuation ceremony was a Lionheart family tradition that took place once every 10 years. During the ceremony, all children from the ages of 10 to 15 who bore the name Lionheart, both direct and collateral descendants, were called to the main estate. The reason for this ceremony was simple. It was to decide who among them were best suited to carry the Lionheart name. After all, wasn't it an embarrassment to claim to be the descendants of the hero without first proving it? So until that day, they weren't allowed to wield a sharp and true weapon until the bloodline continuation ceremony was over. What a stupid tradition. Eugene didn't allow his thoughts to slip out. However, whenever he heard anything about the bloodline continuation ceremony or the family's traditions, he felt disgust and disbelief churn in the pit of his stomach. The only purpose that the bloodline continuation ceremony served was to suppress the collateral descendants. The children of the collateral lines weren't allowed to wield real weapons until after the bloodline continuation ceremony. They also weren't allowed to train their mana. However, the children of the direct line residing in the capital estate were free to wield any weapon they wanted, regardless of their age, and they started learning how to use mana as soon as they could walk. That's what it's all about. They want to beat it into them from a young age that the collateral descendants can never outdo the direct descendants. This act of bullying was so obvious that even a child could see it. Much less Eugene, who, although young in body, had the mind of an adult. Gerhardt couldn't see what was going on inside his son's head. However, he got some idea of what Eugene was feeling from his sullen expression. Although he thought the sight of his frustrated son's face was quite cute, his guilt grew even heavier. If only he was born to the direct line. His son's talent was brilliant, but clear limitations were placed on the Lionheart family's collateral descendants. In the bloodline continuation ceremony 3 years from now, although his son was so outstanding that it was hard to believe he was still a child, there was no way he could compete with the true inheritors who had grown up in the main household. Such a reality made Gerhardt feel tormented. If only he had been born without talent like his father, then Eugene wouldn't have to feel the gap between his innate talent and the challenges posed by reality. Why do you have that sort of look on your face, father? No, it's nothing. As if. You can clearly tell that he's blaming himself again for not being able to give me the best opportunities. Eugene clicked his tongue as he stared at Gerhardt. Because of his clear memories from his previous life, it was difficult to regard Gerhardt as his father. However, it was impossible to deny that he had been reborn as Gerhardt's son. Father. It's been a long time, so why don't we do some play fighting? What? I said, play fighting. Eugene didn't mention the word spar. He was trying to be considerate of his father's feelings if his 10-year-old son were to challenge him to a spar. That's why he used the word play instead, but Gerhardt's expression still froze in horror. Gerhardt first felt the weight of his gut dragging him down. Then he looked at his son's arm brandishing the iron cordwooden sword like a toy. Let's leave that for next time. If his 10-year-old son were to accidentally use his full strength while playing, Gerhardt quickly retreated while sweating buckets, just thinking about it. Eugene giggled as he watched his father make his escape. In the legends and pictures from the fairy tales, the image of Vermouth with the holy sword was always in center place, but according to Eugene's memories, the holy sword wasn't as great of a weapon as the stories made it out to be. Though it did shine pretty brightly, it provided all sorts of help in the dimly lit Demon King's castle, but that was it really. In the first place, as the holy sword was more of a ceremonial sword with an emphasis on appearance rather than function, Vermouth didn't actually like to use it that much. It was to the extent where it was only taken out occasionally to deal with especially tough demons. Vermouth was a master of many different weapons, which had gained him the titles of God of War and Master of All. That guy would pull all sorts of weapons out of his subspace whenever he needed to use something in particular. And on top of all that, he was also good at magic, thought Eugene. Throughout his life, Hamel had never learned any magic. I'd like to think that if I had devoted some time to cracking it, I'd have been better than the average Joe. But even if that were the case, at that time, he hadn't spared magic a single glance. Back when he was a child and still thought he was a genius, the idea of learning magic had never even crossed his mind. That would probably have continued to be the case even if I hadn't met Vermouth. Hamel had gone through a lot of changes after meeting Vermouth. In this world, there were people called geniuses who could excel at everything they tried. Young Hamill had believed himself to be such a genius, but an encounter with a true genius had shattered this childish delusion. He learned that he wasn't a genius. But now, with a click of his tongue, Eugene tilted his head. I have memories of my past life. If that was all I had, then I could easily become as strong as I was back then. He was certain of this. However, Eugene didn't want to be satisfied with reaching just that level of strength. Since he had even reincarnated like this, what meaning would there be in staying at the same level that he had reached in his previous life? After all, he had been reincarnated as a descendant of that Vermouth. Vermouth, thought Eugene as he massaged his thick arms, it looks like there really is something to your blood. Even if a child worked out, they weren't physically able to put on much muscle. However, Eugene had no choice but to admit that, apart from the size of the muscles, his new body was perfect. Although he might not have bulked up, his whole body was wiry and flexible, and it was hard to imagine that a child's body could have such dense musculature. His bones were equally sturdy. Even if he pushed his body to the breaking point, it didn't cause any sequelae, and even serious injuries healed quickly. Although my previous body was already good enough to be mistaken for a genius, this is just there's no comparison. It's enough to make me understand how you could have gotten so strong. From the start, the base specs of their bodies had been different. This fact brought feelings of both joy and bitterness to Eugene. If he had had a body like this in his previous life, it's pointless to think about it. Shaking his head, Eugene rid himself of the idea. His past life belonged in the past. Since he had been reincarnated like this, why bother with the regrets of his previous life? But these thoughts in mind, Eugene attempted to shed his attachments to the past. However, he couldn't quite let go of his regrets. After all, wasn't the only thing that Hamill had left behind as his legacy was that fucking insulting nickname of the stupid Hamill. And what about the others? After returning to his homeland in the Kiel Empire, the Great Vermouth served as a duke before eventually returning the title. He was praised as a hero until the very end. The Kiel Empire held a state funeral for Vermouth's death, and, even now, the anniversary of Vermouth's death was commemorated by the empire. As for the wise Sienna, that uncute girl was invited to the magic kingdom of Aroth, where she became the youngest person in history to rise to the position of a magic tower's head wizard. Although there were only 5 magic towers in Aroth, 2 of them currently had one of Sienna's direct disciples serving as their heads. The faithful Annis, that rotten woman, had actually ended up being canonized as a saint by the Holy Empire of Eurus. Her teachings were so respected that they were even being passed down as a separate volume of scripture. And Eugene just couldn't believe what the brave Molin was said to have done. It was claimed that Molin, that blockhead, had actually founded a kingdom. Did he really manage to gather all the refugees from the lands that had been ravaged by the Demon King's forces and establish a kingdom in his own name? And here's the part that I'm finding the most difficult to understand. Eugene furrowed his brow. Whenever his thoughts turned to this matter, it was always at this point that he felt a familiar surge of rage. It seems like everyone was doing just fine until they died, so why are the demons still around? In his past life as Hamill, he and his companions had ventured into the devildom of Helmuth. While leading the subjugation forces sent from every country, they had killed 3 of the 5 demon kings. Stupid Hamill then died at the 4th demon king's castle. He clearly remembered that, at the moment of his death, he had believed that Vermouth and his other companions would definitely slay the remaining demon kings. However, how were things in reality? The world was at peace, of course. The demon kings no longer held any ambitions of conquering the world, and it was all due to the oath that the great Vermouth had made with the demon kings. Why did he end up making an oath like that? Weren't we supposed to wipe them all out? He didn't know the reasons behind it. But in any case, the war with the demon kings was over and the world was at peace. A peace that had lasted for over 300 years and continued to the present day. Perchance, are you feeling a bit nervous? Eugene lifted his head as he heard a voice speaking to him. He was currently riding inside of a luxurious carriage. A middle-aged man with a stiff face was sitting in the seat across from him. It's because this is my first time in the capital, Eugene muttered as he looked out of the window. He had left behind his mansion in the countryside and arrived at the nearest city after a day's travel in a horse-drawn carriage. Then, after going through several warp gates, he had finally stepped foot in the capital. I understand how you feel, the man sympathized with Eugene. The man's name was Gordon. He was a knight who had sworn allegiance to the main house of Lionheart and he was currently serving as Eugene's escort. Master Eugene, would you mind if I give you a piece of advice? Sure. If you're already feeling nervous, then every day spent at the main estate will feel extremely tortuous. There wasn't a single sign of amusement on Gordon's face. And even though these words had been offered as advice, there wasn't a trace of concern either. Sensing this, Eugene grinned. Thank you for your advice, Sir Gordon. Eugene was well aware of his current plight. As they weren't part of the direct bloodline, the reality was that the collateral descendants were forced to treat even the knights who had been assigned to escort them with wary respect. Much less Eugene's household, who were beneath the notice of even the other collateral branches. Even so, I'm still a Lionheart. They only sent a single knight to escort me, and my father wasn't allowed to accompany me either. Without dropping his smile, Eugene turned back to stare out the window. Although they aren't being too obvious about it, they're really trying to put us in our place. I guess they're getting a head start by crushing our spirits. Bastards. Vermouth, this is all because you went and sowed your seeds all over the place. Eugene imagined how things might unfold in the near future. Seeing as how they were already trying to crush his spirit, he would probably be subjected to even more blatant depression the moment he arrived at the main house. Maybe they'll gather all their knights to welcome us and then loudly announce exactly who is arriving and how humble their background is. No, they would save that sort of thing for those who were actually being treated as competition. Seeing how they had only sent one knight to escort him, they probably wouldn't even bother to arrange a welcoming ceremony for him. How many people are participating in this year's bloodline continuation ceremony? Including Master Eugene, there are 6 people from the collateral lines. In addition, 3 heirs from the main house will also be participating, 3 from the main house. Although Eugene had pitched his voice in an attempt to feign surprise, he had already known in advance who was attending this year's bloodline continuation ceremony. This was all thanks to Gerhardt taking special precautions. Of the 3 people from the direct bloodline, one was the first wife's son, and the other 2 were twins born from the second wife. Within the 5 from the other collateral bloodlines, the only ones who needed to be paid any attention were the 2 from families who had gained quite the prestige despite being collateral bloodlines. I think the oldest was only 15, and there are those even younger than me. Eugene was 13 years old. Upon recalling his current age, he couldn't hold back a sigh. All because of this tradition, was he really being asked to compete with 10-year-olds? Eugene. Whatever you do, don't try to compete with the children of the main house. No matter how excellent you are, you won't be an opponent for the children of the direct bloodline. That's why you should. Eugene recalled the gloomy expression that Gerhard had held at that time. His father couldn't hide his fear that his son might fall into despair once he encountered the children of the main household. Still, I can't help but feel excited to see how talented Vermouth's descendants are. Eugene tore his eyes away from the window. They had already passed by all the splendid scenery the capital had to offer, and now the carriage was leaving the city behind and entering a forest. From this point on, we have entered the Lionheart estate. The forest was surrounded by tall walls. But there's no need to be in a hurry to get your things ready. We still have a long way to go from here. Even though he hadn't been getting ready to leave the carriage at all, Gordon still smiled as he gave this teasing advice. I get it, you bastard. Must be nice to have such a large estate. It's not even your land, so why are you acting so smug? Whoa, so this whole forest is the private property of the main house. Yep, if it's this large, isn't it inconvenient getting around? There are warp gates installed everywhere, is that so? Then why am I currently riding in a carriage? That's because we couldn't even be bothered to give Master Eugene permission to use the warp gates. While holding this back and forth conversation inside his head, Eugene continued to stare outside the window. Just as Gordon had said, the carriage finally came to a stop after driving on for quite some time. After opening the door on his side and getting down from the carriage, Gordon walked over to open the door for Eugene. Welcome to the Lionheart family's main estate, Gordon said politely, with a bow of his head. The mansion was visible through the wide open gates. Just as expected, not a single person had come out to welcome him. The Lionheart, Eugene slowly raised his gaze. White flags lined the path leading up from the main gate entrance, and a brave lion was embroidered in the center of each flag. This was the personal sigil of the main house. Vermouth's Lionheart. Eugene looked down at his own chest. His clothes were bare of any decoration. Only Vermouth Lionheart's direct descendants were allowed to have the lion sigil sewn onto their left chest. If only I had also left descendants. In his previous life, Hamel had neither married anyone nor had any children. No. It's a good thing I didn't have any. If that were the case, I would have been left with some pointless regrets. Still, seeing the family's flags lined up like this, he couldn't help but feel regret for his past life. Have any of my other relatives arrived yet? Master Eugene is the first to arrive. Eugene thought with a nod of his head. The place where Eugene was led to was an annex built off of the main hall. On the way there, he hadn't even caught a glimpse of a single relative who bore the lion on their chest that showed they belonged to the main family. Why were they being so aloof? Shouldn't they at least feel some curiosity and come to take a look at the arrival of their 13-year-old relative? But at least he wasn't being received with complete rudeness. Upon arriving at the annex, he found that a single personal attendant had been attached to him. The female servant greeted him, "Please call me Nina." Though from the looks of it, she was a young girl who wasn't much older than Eugene, Eugene couldn't muster up much dissatisfaction for this. "If there is anything you need, please ring this bell," Nina said as she bowed her head and handed Eugene a small bell. She was probably in her late teens, at the very most. "Do you mind if I speak comfortably?" "Of course, please do so." "Am I the only one using this entire annex?" Eugene asked as he looked around the spacious annex. He was only asking for the sake of confirmation. Eugene knew that this couldn't really be the case. For one thing, Nina was far too young to oversee an entire annex by herself. I'm afraid that is not the case, but there shouldn't be any discomfort during your stay. So you're saying that I'm going to be living with some other relatives, Eugene confirmed. Yes. Do you know when they'll be arriving? They all should arrive within 4 days at the very latest. Eugene snorted at this reply. Because this just meant that he would be stuck here for 4 days. Is there a gymnasium around the back? Yes. Do I need permission from the main house to practice my swings with a wooden sword? Because that's just what I'm going to do, Eugene declared with a smile as he headed straight to the gym. But the helpless look on her face, Nina trailed behind Eugene.